Hi, everybody. Uh, Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be part of this important conference and looking forward to chatting with you in the non-recorded part. So, as historians of Canada, we know Hegel's story of Minerva's owl, who doesn't begin her flight until the gathering dusk, from Harold Innis. It tells us that we can only truly understand something that is at the very least dying, if not completely dead. Is neoliberalism in the gathering dusk? I would say yes and no. Its insistence on the primacy of the individual maximizing their potential in the market is deeply ingrained in the way we live, the way we work, the way we learn, the way we borrow. It's still being acted out every day in our lives, in our imaginations, and in our institutions. But since 2008, neoliberalism as a political logic has been increasingly discussed, identified, rejected, othered, as the critical theorists would say. Political rhetoric that no longer resonates with our common sense, our map of political possibilities, draws our attention as scholars precisely because it's already othered. So when an instrument of thought becomes an object of thought, the work of historical understanding is already underway, so to speak. Speaking for myself, I can say that I became a historian largely because of my opposition to neoliberalism. I moved into history in my 30s after being a critical theorist for several years, and I was drawn into the discipline to a large part by Ian Mackay's essay on the liberal order framework, which was the first explicit attempt to cast social and cultural history as an anti-neoliberal project. And the Wilson Institute's recent blog series on the history of neoliberalism kind of signposts that long-standing tradition in Mackay's work. As a historian, I wanted to write about how political imaginaries and political possibilities are formed. So the idea that income tax could distribute income, for instance, or the idea that the welfare state was inefficient, had failed. Now, as a part of maximizing my return on investment in my eminently marketable skills as an educator, I teach political studies seminars. And each November, I tell my students that neoliberalism replaced Keynesianism sometime in the 70s or 80s or 90s or whenever. And every time I do that, a little piece of my historian's heart dies. So in this paper, I want to begin to atone for that work by doing a detailed empirical tracing of the development of neoliberalism in the very specific documentary context of Saturday Night Magazine in the 70s. Where and when did neoliberalism begin to replace Keynesianism in that context? What did it look like in this particular publication, in this particular era? Paul Pearson has written in Politics and Time that historians are irritatingly insistent on particularity, drawn to the idiosyncratic, ever vigilant that lest our studies yield falsifiable conclusions, which I think is largely true. It's a disciplinary orientation. Historians like to see the texture of the argument to trace the shifting political ground in the impressions of movable type, and to try, as Quentin Skinner says, seeing things their way, right? So these things are important historically. It's important to acknowledge people's, the development of their thought, and it can help us understand how rhetoric changes the imaginary historically. Saturday Night is a general interest magazine with a focus on the arts that was started around the turn of the 20th century in Toronto. It was conservative in a general sense and sophisticated culturally. In the 1940s, it became famous for the civil libertarian stance taken by the editor, B.K. Sandwell. So it's a good place to trace a shift in how people thought because it's not deeply partisan. Partisanship tends to obscure imaginary shifts like neoliberalism And because Saturday Night endeavors to write things that are intelligent but also entertaining and accessible, unlike a lot of the writing at the same time in the Globe or the Financial Post, which would have been much more technical. Saturday Night published long pieces to sort of explain and tell stories about what was going on to a general readership it understood as being informed and intelligent. So we want to know what those stories were. So at the start of the 70s, the bulk of Saturday Night's political and social commentary, and in particular, the work of its editor, Robert Fulford, could be described as being immediately post-60s. So scholars of the long 60s have discussed the idea of seeing the 70s as, to a large extent, a continuation of the story of the 60s with radical politics, the counterculture, feminism, civil rights, decolonization, and the environment, actually intensifying in many places in the 1970s. In Saturday Night, there's a version of this long 60s. It's expressed through the writers and Fulford in particular in trying to disaggregate, to split the social and political legacy of the 60s by expressing support for the substance, the general substance of changes, while rejecting with great derision the style and tone and almost all the personnel of the counterculture and also political radicals. So Fulford's notebook goes through a long list of things that have to be salvaged from the 60s and be absorbed into the mainstream to enable the confrontation to be, let's move beyond the confrontation and let's accept this basic principle. Fulford doesn't say this explicitly, but I think the idea of, say, praising the peace movement in general while criticizing and heaping scorn on specific anti-war activists is to try to establish a consensus so that political disagreement can move on to better, more interesting debates. Fulford is critical later on in the 74 federal election. He's critical of the candidates for being too similar, for all being sort of a version of a liberal. None of there's no actual conservative running. There's no actual socialist running. But the magazine also continues through the 70s to dismiss conservative positions that it sees as clearly not practical, castigating them as right-wing. So this tendency as the 70s moderates, as the politics begin to shift, but the position of Saturday Night at the 60s begins as a kind of yes and, we accept the nature, the basic of this, and now we want to move on. So a major change begins to affect the nature of Saturday Night's political coverage, such that the magazine moves pretty decisively on from evaluating the legacy of the 60s with the announcement in August 1971 that the Nixon administration was imposing a surtax on all imports. They also canceled the convertibility of dollars into gold, but that's not as relevant here. So this austerity shock, as it's often called, was a response to the first stirrings of an OPEC oil embargo, but oil and gas were not discussed in Saturday Night before August 1971. So, and I think this partly reflects the place of politics in Saturday Night, that it's not a political magazine, it's a magazine that discusses politics sometimes. So if they don't have somebody who's interested in writing about that, or they can't think of a good example, they leave it. And I think that part of it is that the oil and gas issue didn't have a narrative attached to it until Nixon's announcement, which was seen by the editors and contributors to Saturday Night as an existential threat to Canada's economy as it was constituted in the 70s. So you have Diane Cohen, previously of the C.D. Howe Institute, who writes in December 1971 that the United States served notice on August 15th that the period of post-war reconstruction was over. So there's a sense of a major historic change arising from that announcement, which is interesting because that's not something that a lot of people discuss as a major turning point. So what is striking, though, about Saturday Night's panicked response to the Nixon austerity shocks is that there's so little coherence to it. or to the discussion of inflation more broadly and the major oil and gas shocks that followed, so over the next few years. For example, Saturday Night had always had a very complex relationship to cultural and economic nationalism that was very dominant in the early 70s, in particular on the left and in the arts. But in the January 1974 notebook, Fulford called for the establishment of a federal crown corporation that would extract, refine, and distribute Canada's oil and gas across the country, and publishes a major feature article, not by Fulford, arguing that the mistakes were made in the way that the industry and the government arranged oil and gas, such that the Quebec and the Maritimes were buying their gas on the international market. So then, as they're trying to absorb these, make sense of these political crises, a crisis hits Saturday Night itself, the first of two in the early to mid 70s. So the magazine actually folds in late 1974 because of revenue and debt problems. And it's revived 6 months later by a very unlikely combination of advocacy from arts organizations and a large financial contribution from Imperial Oil. $100,000 came from Imperial Oil. The magazine has a new design, it's twice as thick, and it has some editorial changes that I'll get to. Then in later 1975, a postal strike prevents the distribution of the November issue, which leads to advertisers balking at buying ads in the February issue for 1976, which never appears. So the magazine survives these crises, but it's clearly transformed in style and tone and focus, and the stories it tells about Canada's politics and economy reflect the crises it has survived, right? Its internal absorption of those things. Fulford's notebook is explicit about the shift, noting in the first issue after they come back that new publisher Edgar Cowan and Fulford agreed that Saturday Night's, quote, range should be broader, for instance. Business should be covered more extensively than it had been in recent years, end quote. The magazine, Fulford noted, quote, should be more serious, both more serious and more frivolous. It should be more serious in the sense of containing better research, more thoughtful, and in some cases longer articles, and it should be more frivolous, acknowledging and celebrating the pleasures of life, end quote. So on the serious side, Saturday Night begins running a regular column called The Economy in addition to The Capital, although both columns sort of come and go depending whether there's a feature that kind of preempts it. And on the frivolous side, there's a much larger travel section, restaurant reviews, and there's even a wine column by George Bain, Globe and Mail columnist. So the magazine still featured lots of cultural commentary, and several issues would pass without significant mention of oil and gas, but several new themes began to emerge after the rebirth, notably rising spending on social programs by the federal government and the growing power of public sector unions, both of which are increasingly characterized as causal, as the key underlying cause of Canada's political economic crises in the 70s. So Sandra Gwynn's reporting on the federal government in particular, which ran in nearly every issue in the mid-70s, painted a picture of Ottawa as being, stuffed to overflowing with overpaid, fancy bureaucrats who were obsessed with their own career advancement and acronyms and writing memoranda. So Gwynn is a complex figure, though. So she obviously has some nostalgia for the old Ottawa men, the Mandarins, but she also dismisses the idea that they were hired on the basis of merit. So she's critical of them. She also agrees that prioritizing the hiring of women and francophones is good, but it worries about Anglophone men who might be passed over, presumably on the basis of merit is why she's concerned about that. So there's some strange contradictions there. Later, a few years later, she'll write about the cutting of the Company of Young Canadians with obvious regret. So Gwynn is obviously struggling with what was lost and wonders kind of whose side the federal government is on and the bureaucrats are on. So as late as 79, she writes, the title of this paper, "The Old Rules No Longer Apply," and we haven't discovered the new ones. Other people writing for the magazine were not as complex. So Peter Reilly, for example, who covered politics sort of intermittently with Gwynne, wrote an early article about public sector unions. And he noted that more and more in the past few years, quote, men and women who thought of themselves above union activity, who wouldn't have picked up a union card with forceps, are now not only joining unions in their thousands, but walking the picket lines joyously, and in the process infuriating large numbers of their fellow Canadians in a way that no group of organized workers has ever before. Douglas Fullerton, who wrote not that regularly for Saturday Night, published a long and fascinating article in 76 about the growth of government spending under Trudeau. So this kind of a few thousand words, more than 2,000 words, I would say, was published on this topic. And the article is interesting. It is largely historical and traces the development of what Fullerton calls a big income tax machine capable of grinding out a cornucopia of dollars, which of course I liked, gestures vaguely to Keynesian justifications for increased spending to prevent a post-war depression, but he never mentions the British North America Act or the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as factors that might have required the federal government to take on huge taxing responsibilities in order for the provinces to develop social programs. Another preoccupation is with the public sector unions and the reforms to unemployment insurance in 1971, which Fullerton argues constitute a basic alteration of our social way of life. He writes that, quote, expectations across the country have been stimulated by unnecessarily generous wage settlements and labor policies in the public sector. Expanded welfare programs have led people to ask for more and are persuading many young Canadians that welfare is an acceptable way of life. We have become a greedy people and seem unconcerned about how our demands affect the nation's interests. Through the course of the 1970s, Saturday Night moved from a position of trying to recuperate a new consensus coming out of the 1960s to a stance of ideological uncertainty with a marked animus towards public spending and organized labor. And this position pointed towards an embrace of an emerging neoliberal imaginary. This shift happened slowly and unevenly, with many authors like Robert Fulford and Sandra Gwynne expressing clear ambivalence, but it also happened very quickly in response to crises, both in Canada's economy and in Saturday Night as a magazine. So whether Saturday Night's contributors were right or wrong that public sector unions and overly generous spending on social programs were the chief causes of Canada's economic malaise in the 70s, what they began to write with increasing but never complete coherence through the 70s would become a dominant worldview by the 1990s and would be the justification for successful attacks on the welfare state and labor rights in that period. And those effects are still with us today. Thank you.